Today I'm going to be reading a short story that I wrote called Marty Got Deported. Martin was typically found at forehead depth, reading a book of ancient history, esoteric philosophy, or some canonical classic he wanted to catch up on. Other times he prowled the racks of a record store, picking up vinyls and cassettes by obscure musicians with no presence on streaming platforms. Occasionally he'd go to a small cinema in a sketchy area to watch 35mm prints of 4-hour Turkish films where a feral cat roamed a desolate field while a narrator recited religious texts. These were his tastes. This was his way. He rolled his eyes at anything enjoyed by the masses and felt barely concealed disdain for anyone who couldn't keep up with his references. For certain activities, say enjoying a meal, he was one to really make a display of how refined he was. He moaned with delight, highlighting the unique textures and flavors behind each gourmet bite. He moved with carefully studied poise, his pinky involuntarily lifting when imbibing his liquor. He would, very overly dramatically, lay his napkin on his lap before digging into his dish. When he was in school, and then later working something ordinary and mundane at the office, he had no difficulty earning the appreciation of teachers and authority figures. He was always well behaved on time and never thought twice about reporting someone who did otherwise. And though his facial features clearly rose from the gene pools of Tenochtitlan or some other Mesoamerican heritage site, he was one who took great pride in mimicking and adapting the ways of his educators, speaking refined, with prescribed grammar, acting proud, and looking down upon those who did not or could not conform to the tenets of good taste. So it came to pass, very much as a rude awakening, when on his way to enjoy a freshly baked quiche at the newly opened glitzy bistro, that he was detained and sent into a truck, alongside the rest of the brown-skinned staff in the back of the kitchen. It was there, in the damp, claustrophobic darkness of a deportation van, where men and women in glowing yellow work shirts and battle-tested flannel jackets wept and cursed, that he sat, truly befuddled. This was obviously a mistake, some great misunderstanding. He was born here, in the United States. He was an American citizen, a natural fact, proven by his driver's ID and other official records, all of which, conveniently, he had forgotten that day. Though he was fully acclimated to the culture, and was very much abiding by all the rules of the land, this didn't seem to matter under the new authoritarian regime. He tried to impress upon his captors that he was quite erudite and well-behaved, even more so than they were. That did not win them over. Without much trouble, he was sent back to the ancestral land, the land where his father and mother grew, learned, and met. Back to the village where his grandparents ran as children, where his great-grandparents cultivated the land with oxen and rickety wooden carts. It was a podunk little village, the very manifestation of all that was considered third world. Tiny buildings were covered in peeling paint, with rows of oxidizing corrugated steel, rows upon rows dispersed across streets of foot-trodden dirt, all oriented in curving, bifurcating streets that seemed to have very little rhyme or reason from a city planning point of view. Most of the stores there were run out of personal homes or out of a handmade cart. People there still had their bread delivered door to door, their water still brought in by a boy walking about with heavy bottles of plastic. Though he initially resisted his thrusting to this country land, he was amazed by the simple fact that a part of him certainly seemed to belong there. The villagers gazed upon him with unconcealed confusion. Facially, he was not out of place at all. Every corner he stepped, every bar he entered, and at the aisle of every tiny store, a mirror image of himself stared back in confusion. He walked with a different verve, in a more rushed and neurotic tempo, adequate for the pace of a bustling city, but of no use and even a hindrance in some instances for those living in a quaint, quiet locale. Behaviorally, he may as well have been from another galaxy, and though he spoke Spanish with sufficient comprehension, his awkward, anglicized syntax and complete ignorance of local patois immediately outed him instantly as a stranger. He was just wrong in so many ways. Articulateness, erudite elocution. These were qualities he'd sown over years of reading, writing, and deep thought processes. When it came to expressing himself in English, he really could express some very deep thoughts. But his Spanish was a different story. Villagers often laughed, openly, in his face, mocking his lack of fluency. They had said he spoke like a gringo who slacked off in class, mixing tenses, confusing conjugations, misgendering nouns, and frequently making up his own language by taking English words and putting a little Hispanic stink on them. To say he was embarrassed, he would say he was embarazado, inadvertently claiming to have been impregnated. When asked where the nearest bus stop was, he'd respond with a simple, ungrammatical no sabo. And if he tried to buy a sandwich from a corner shop, inevitably he'd always get a funny glare, followed by a bemused utterance of, "You're not from around here." When at bars attempting to stir up some casual conversation, though he tried very hard not to, he would, without failure, fall into the cringe-inducing habit of talking overly philosophically about cosmic matters and elevated states of consciousness, when most of the drinkers there really just preferred talking about soccer matches and attractive women. At home with his relatives, he ultimately surmised, "My funds are running low," he told his aunt at dinner. "You know what you're gonna do for work?" "Well, what is there to do?" he asked in between unenthusiastic swipes at a plate of flavorless beans and burnt tortillas. "Ernesto, down the street, has a body shop. I hear he's looking for a new apprentice. And there's Lady Menchaca, who's looking for some help with her fruit stand." But none of these roles spoke to his soul. Later that evening, he walked out into the patio to bathe himself with a plastic bucket in a cube-shaped reservoir, slowly splashing his body with cold water, cleansing himself with a bar of sulfur. The chilliness intermingling with the stuffy breeze of the night all gave him little to think about besides how cold and uncomfortable he felt in this new environment. He needed a change, quick, to something modern, to something familiar. He had decided that if he was ever to find somewhere he could function well in, somewhere he could get along and not feel like such an outsider, he would have to go to the capital city. The city was a 3-hour bus ride away. Buses in the third world somehow managed to be worse than buses in the first world. They were crammed full of elbows and faces, bodies pressed against the scratched-up surfaces, while vendors squeezed their way around with bags of things that they tried very loudly to dispense from one stop to the next. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I can have your attention, please. If you are in need of a refreshing thirst quencher, may I suggest to you the satisfying, delicious taste of this bubbly cola, made from sweet sugar canes and other natural ingredients. Today I'm bringing this product to you for the generous price of 2 liters for just 1. They were practically shouting into Martin's ear, and by the midpoint of the journey, after the 12th vendor had come and gone, he felt he was going deaf. What seemed to astound him the most, however, was how little people seemed to care about walking into the stuffed bus with smelly buckets of chicken or other weird-smelling foods in their well-worn Tupperware. The whole car reeked of things that did not combine well. The scent of fish intermingling with the fragrance of dairy, the potent aroma of human perspiration gelling with the stench of unfreshened breath. At last, the funky bus arrived at the capital. When he dismounted, what he saw was a clear, picturesque view of tall buildings, stately plazas, and classical architecture, all things that spoke of old-world influence and neo-colonial aesthetics. "This is nice," he spoke aloud in English. So he strolled on, and soon he was met with a familiar array of shops. Pop Marts, Starbucks, and Targets, places like these in proximity to your typical H&Ms, KFCs, and CVSs. It occurred to him almost immediately that beneath the veneer of historical ancestral beauty that he was initially so entranced by, this homeland of his was not much different from the place he was just deported from. Place after place, it was all plainly the same. Poor municipalities, big bustling cities, and mid-sized towns in sprawling Americana, to the tropical surroundings of Latin America, the proliferation of corporatized franchises was identical across the board. Yanked from the comfort of his home to this uprooted state of moneyless displacement, geography notwithstanding, it was really quite frightening to his eyes to see firsthand how flat and uninteresting the world seemingly was. There was apparently no escape from the ravages of globalism, like a void washing all the color and vitality of a place and deforming it into something banal and lifeless. Wherever you went, be it the Colosseum, the Eiffel Tower, or the Pyramids of Giza, you could reliably enjoy the conventional conveniences of a Wetzel's Pretzels or a Nordstrom. Everything he was recently so enthused about when it came to experiencing the capital city seemed to wither away just as easily. With his head bowed in disillusionment, he arrived at a bus stop featuring an ad from the nearby museum, promoting a special exhibit of lesser-known Renaissance masters. "Which way?" he asked a young lady there, standing, waiting for a bus, in a traditional dress that seemed to have gone unwashed for several days at least. She regarded him with eyes so melancholy, pouchy, and tired, captivating nevertheless, and suddenly alert when noticing him. "Hello, mister. New here?" "You can tell. You will have a good time here." "Thanks. You think so?" "There's something special about you." He chortled, bashful and flattered, so lost in her gray eyes by the compliment she paid that he didn't immediately notice her hand reaching for his pocket. He slapped his hand down on hers, felt the soft back of it. "What the hell?" he muttered angrily in Spanish. She gasped. They entered into a tug-of-war, competing for ownership of his wallet. He won and instantly dashed. She followed after him. "Mister, wait. Go away. I don't want to talk to you. But, leave me alone." He kept on, looking resentfully as he did. Eventually, she took the hint and gave up the chase. For the rest of the walk, he kept a close eye on his pocket. He arrived at a cozy square of a neighborhood, where young bohemians dawdled along from trendy cafes to boutique clothing stores. Here he found a spot called Paramo Books, where bookshelf after bookshelf was lined with Camus, Sartre, and Foucault, overlooking a tame display of best-selling hardcovers. It was a rustic, relaxing place. Next aisle down, by the poetry books, where stood busts of Neruda and Paz, Martin eavesdropped on a poetry circle that was in full swing, bustling with energy. Look at these Hispanic beatniks, hipsters, and artistes, he thought. For the first time since being deported, he felt at home. These are my people. So he sat down among the crowd, listening to the light finger snaps as one speaker left the podium and made way for another. "This poem is called Monstruos. Gente de los bosques, ustedes son nuestras voces. Estamos en el trance de los monstruos. Restregan contra nosotros. Ni una sola alma puede limpiarse. Igualmente como separarse. A lo sublime esperamos todo." The crowd was into it. "But, Martin said out loud. "Seems a little safe, don't you think? I appreciate the metaphorical experimentation, but I really think you could implement more imagist illusions to further achieve the metaphysical effect with perhaps greater emphasis on tactile resonance." Everyone in the circle turned to look at him. Martin was unsure what to make of it. As it turned out, they were very receptive towards this strange new visitor. The poet himself, who was also the leader of this group, invited him back to his mansion in the gated community. Out of nowhere, Martin was exposed to a level of wealth he had never had access to in America, and now it was opened up to him with decidedly little hardship. That night, in a spacious living room, surrounded by a pool table and all sorts of expensive paintings, they spoke of many fine things. Of art, of literature and cinema, of philosophy and ethics, and many other such topics. They spoke to him in English, as they wanted to practice theirs, and they all seemed wildly entranced with his knowledge. For the first time in a while, Martin did not feel so out of place. It was when they started to talk about politics that things seemed to take a turn. "Oh, these dirty folks and beggars lining up the streets. They're such a nuisance." "Oh, well," Martin mumbled, "they're not so bad. They're just all trying to get by. I can't believe the assemblymen are serious suggesting we spend more on taxes to pay for these dirty people to go to school. Why don't they just pay for it like the rest of us?" "Well, there's nothing wrong with public education. I myself am the product of..." "Tell us, Martin, what do you think we should do about these people going on and on about the environment? Isn't it annoying how they constantly get in the way of economic developments?" Martin saw them for what they were. People who ethnically were exactly like him, only the wealth hoarding and land plundering of their upbringings had endowed them with perspectives he could not avow, no matter how much he wanted to connect with them on an intellectual level. They were just a bunch of rich young folks who had dyed their hair blonde, lightened their skin, put blue contacts in their eyes, and paid for expensive surgeries to reshape their noses and chins. Also that they wouldn't have to deal with the shame of looking in the ethnic physiognomy that they were all born into. Between the boisterousness of their laughs, the cleanliness of their clothes, and the way that the champagne flowed from one sip to the next, Martin could no longer tell what these people were truly about. Did they have any interest in him as a person, or was he merely a novelty act? He didn't feel so at home anymore, and promptly he excused himself, asking the chauffeur to escort him out of that neighborhood. Martin rode in the back of a black Lincoln, the chauffeur with driving gloves and a handsome hat on his head, transporting him through a serpentine road of palm trees and glowing stars. So, what family do you hail from, sir? No one noteworthy, just a bunch of immigrants from here. You grew up in America? Yes. Martin met eyes with the driver from the shiny surface of the rearview mirror, catching brief glimpses of his indigenous face, not dissimilar to his, any time they drove past a street lamp. What made you want to move back here? Asked the driver. The question amused Martin. Just needed a change of scenery, I guess. Do you miss it? Martin asked to hear the question a second time, so he could have a moment to come up with a half-hearted answer. A little. Mostly I miss my books. My collection of albums. I never got the chance to pack them up and bring them here. You like it here? Martin nodded. Feel at home? Martin did not respond to that one. You know, the driver continued, I always wanted to go to El Norte. Yeah? I never had the bravery to do it. It's kind of a mess now. Can't be worse than here. Life is so difficult for some of us, you know. I guess everywhere is kind of like that, isn't it? I would have loved to have gone to a good school, to learn things, like you know things. Yeah, a lot of good it did for me, Martin smirked. But God has been good to me. I still have my health. I still have my life. In spite of everything, He still watches over me, protects me, the driver continued. Good for you, Martin said. We all need something to keep us going. Where should I drop you off? Can you take me to the museum? It's closed this hour, you know. That's okay. I'd still like to see it. The museum at night was filled with the pulsing nocturnal score of passing cars and distant thumping clubs. A gigantic building of stunning architecture, built on the trampled ground of a once proud native land, where tiger warriors and wise shamans once conducted business on a kingdom of gold forging and knowledge scribing. When he saw the banners on the side, with all the companies that sponsored this place, the fossil fuel giants and the processed food monopolies, he could not find it in his heart any longer to admire any of it. He thought a lot about the driver. Even though this driver presumably had no knowledge of the exquisite joy that came from listening to a Philip Glass symphony, and likely had no experience with the mind-altering beauty of a minimalist Agnes Martin painting, none of this could warrant Martin's sense of superiority. After all, that Martin possessed the mind and interest that he did was no testament to his intellectual superiority. It merely spoke to the opportunities and the privileges he enjoyed from having a brave family willing to make that uncertain trek into America, to acquire those luxuries, those comforts that only came from plundering a country like this one. If his parents had stayed and he was forced to grow up in here instead, who was to say he wouldn't have ended up becoming the one driving that car? It all came down to circumstance. Really, it all came down to chance. If anything, the driver lived more honestly, more authentically than Martin could ever hope to in his own life. And with that, he slept on the bench for a few hours in the frosty cold, waiting for the first bus back to the direction he came. Time went on, seasons fell, and years melded, one after the other. And though strangers were a rarity in that village, it is said there is an apt, proud bread baker there, toiling away in the dark, beneath a steel roof, a journeyman at his craft who, if you ask him what his favorite Shakespeare play is, he will give you quite a lengthy response.